Hi, everyone. I hope this is working. I am glad to be back, if that's what you would call this. I feel really nervous for some reason about these video lectures and really awkward. I don't really like hearing my voice and seeing my face in this way. But here we are. So also you'll probably get to see my cat who's in my lap right now, Hachie. The other cats in the bedroom, they show up at some point. That's West. Oh, here she is. So this is going to be awkward, probably for the rest of the semester, but at least certainly this lecture. So I want to maybe start by walking through what I hope to accomplish in these video lectures and what they're for, and then walk through some the changes to the syllabus that I'd like to make, and then go on to the regular class talking about the concept of the day, which is types of narration, and then talk about Rue, and then talk about Brian Bethune's interview with Kim Twee and his comments on her work. So let me go to the PowerPoint. One sec. Okay. This is taking longer than I thought it would. Okay, hopefully you can see the PowerPoint now. So I have the quote of the day here. I'm not really going to go over them very much in these lectures. They're mostly there to kind of stimulate discussion in our classes, and that's not really relevant anymore, but you can look over them if you want. I think they're kind of interesting. So these lectures, I'm hoping, will serve a couple of purposes. For one, it'll give me a chance to explain changes to the class and make announcements and things in maybe a clearer way. I have a chance to explain things maybe in more detail than I will in announcements. Hopefully I'll be able to say enough about the readings to kind of give you ideas for your own writing. I can hopefully simulate the kind of thinking that I hope that you'll do in your own writing process, the ways that you might think about these texts and ask questions and things. And also it'll give me a chance to point out things I think are odd or interesting or curious or mysterious about these readings. As always, I'm not really intending to tell you how you have to think about these readings or what they're really about or anything. It's really just to stimulate your own thinking and your own writing. So here are some syllabus changes that I'm planning on making. Basically, these are the things that I announced in the email, and it sounds, from the few responses that I got, it sounds like they mostly seem to be, you mostly seem to think that they will work. So I want to kind of formally announce them today. So the biggest, maybe most complicated change has to do with the Canvas posts and the responses to those Canvas posts. So from now on, in addition to the regular Canvas posts that you post before every class, you're going to be responding to two people's Canvas posts. This will count towards your attendance for each class. Each response has to be at least 2 sentences, so more than 1 sentence, and include 1 piece of evidence. I'm going to be pretty flexible about what that evidence is. I guess what I want you to think about here is in-class discussion. When you respond to something in class, you typically expect, you plan on saying something you typically wouldn't raise your hand and respond in class to just say, I agree with what the last person said. That would be odd. You would usually say something to comment on the proceedings. And that's what I expect these Canvas posts to do. I'm not looking for, you know, a whole other Canvas post in response. But I expect you to contribute something more than just saying, I agree with what the last person said. The responses are going to be due by class time, by the next class time. So responses to today's Canvas posts, for example, will be due by 1 p.m. on Thursday. And then responses to Thursday's Canvas posts will be due 1 p.m. on Tuesday. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm worried that might be a little bit complicated. Of course, you can post whenever you want, as soon as the post is available. But I want to, you know, accommodate people who might not have ready internet access all the time. I will also be posting responses, and you can feel free to respond to me. I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. One, just like these lectures, I want to, you know, stimulate discussion and give you new ways of thinking about things. But also, especially for those people who post early, I want to give you other responses that you can respond to. So you can feel free to respond to the things that I say if they move you. You can respond to anyone except yourself. So you can respond to any Canvas post you want, you can respond to any responses that you want, but you can't respond to your own post or your own response. Let's see, other changes. I'm going to postpone the Essay 2 deadline to Tuesday the 7th, so it'll give you 5 more days. Hopefully that'll be sufficient. And of course, as always, extensions are possible. If you need one, just let me know ahead of time so we can work out a new deadline. I will probably make some changes to the final Essay 2, but I haven't quite decided what those are yet, so keep an eye out for those changes. I'd like to make it a little bit, maybe, I don't know if I would say simpler, but take out some of the requirements for that essay, most likely. But again, I'll let you know in the future. And then the critical essays in Unit 4, I'm gonna make optional. So those are the 3, the essay by Kristen Lucas, Rory Rai Anderson, and Gonçalves and Braga. Those are gonna be optional readings if you choose to read them. Author introductions, I'm gonna keep things the same as I said they would be in our last in-person class. So if you have an author introduction, the deadline should be the same unless you have some extenuating circumstance that you tell me about. You should email me your author introduction by 1 o'clock on the deadline. All of these times are Eastern time, so Bloomington time. And I will post these author introductions in a file on Canvas. I haven't done that yet, but I've received several of them. I haven't read them yet, but I'll review them today and post them for everybody. After posting this lecture, I plan on kind of formally posting an announcement about these changes and also changing the syllabus and all of the assignments. One of the things that I really dislike about making big changes to the class in the middle is that things end up falling through the cracks. So very likely, after I post a changed syllabus, there are going to be some things on Canvas that I forget to change. So just so you know, the syllabus, the new syllabus that I post is going to take precedence over things that have already been posted on Canvas. So if you notice that the syllabus says X and some assignment that I posted at the beginning of the semester says Y, follow X. And if that creates a problem, I will make changes to the syllabus accordingly. But I'm going to try to use this, I'm going to try as best I can to keep the new syllabus accurate. If you have any problems at all with the way the class is working, please let me know and I will do my best to address those problems. Okay, so hopefully that was clear. Hopefully you can all hear me. I did a couple of tests. I think my voice is loud enough, but anyway, you can all let me know. Okay, so let's do the concept of the day. Actually, I wish I had set a timer. Okay, so today I want to talk about different types of narration. Now, we talked about narration before. We talked about narrative voice and narrative tense. So first, second, third person narration and present, past, future. We're going to talk about something slightly different now, but really it's kind of part of the same lecture. Last time when I talked about narration, I said that narration is kind of what fiction is made of, in the same way that a painting is determined by the surface on which it's painted. Music is shaped by its time signature. Film is shaped by the camera lens. Drama is shaped by the stage and things like that. These are things that within that work of art, these are always going to be present no matter what you do. You can't have a painting without some kind of surface. It can be a traditional canvas. It can be a wall. It can be a piece of old newspaper or whatever, but there's going to be some kind of surface for painting. You can't have music without some kind of time signature. It just can't exist. People experiment with that idea. They push the limits, but it's always going to exist if it's music. And in the same way, narration is what makes the fiction fiction. If you have a story, no matter what you do, some kind of narrative voice is going to come out of it. And we've read authors who try to mess with that. But the narration kind of always percolates in some way. So the kind of narration we're going to talk about today, or I guess really when we talk about types of narration, we're talking about the different ways that fiction can be organized, what I'll call kind of the texture of fiction. So if we think about painting again, going back to painting, I mentioned that narration in fiction is kind of like the surface or the canvas in painting. If you think about the ways that different kinds of surfaces create different kinds of painting or different textures of painting, right? So the difference between something painted on a traditional canvas or something painted on a wall, right? Like a graffiti or a fresco. Think about how those things are received differently. That's kind of what different kinds of narration can do. They kind of change the surface of a work of fiction and therefore change how it functions. So before talking about these different types, I want to talk about different layers of narration. So these are, when I say that narration is always present in a work of fiction, actually all 4 of these layers of narration are present in every work of fiction, even though some of them might be conflated, some of them might be hard to piece apart, but they're always there. Or I guess I should say at least 3 of them are. So narrator as character is not always there. That's really only there in a first person, maybe second person narration. So in something like recitative, where we have a first person narrator in Twyla, the narrator is a character in the work of fiction. They describe themselves doing certain things. So that's not in every single work, but it's in some works of fiction. The narrator as narrator is always there. There's always some kind of narrative voice, whether it's first person, second person, or third person, that's always there kind of presenting the work to us. And this is true whether the narrator is a character in the work or not. So in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, for example, the narrator is arguably not an actual character in the world. They're presenting the world to us, but there's still a narrator there. And this narrator can be trustworthy or not trustworthy. We can, just like a character in a work of fiction, we can take their word seriously or not. Behind the narrator, there's something that we would call an implied author. So in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, for example, we have a narrator who's telling us what Omelas is like, but we can still imagine what Le Guin might want us to think about the narrator. So several people in their Canvas posts and in their essays writing about The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas wrote about why we shouldn't trust the narrator of this story. And in order to think about why we shouldn't trust the narrator of the story, we have to imagine someone behind the narrator. We have to imagine somebody who has an idea that's different from the narrator's, that they want to get across through this unreliable narrator. And that's what we would call the implied author. We say the implied author because honestly, we can't really know what Ursula Le Guin is thinking. We can't get inside her head, but we know what she wants us to think, or we can make guesses about what she wants us to think about the narrator. So that's why we call it an implied the implied author instead of just the author. And then behind the implied author, there is some kind of real author. And we can never get inside the author's actual head, but we can make we can learn certain things about the author. That's why we have author introductions and things. So for example, we can learn something about Kim Thuy's life. And in learning about her life, we can make some guesses about the implied author, and then we can use the implied author to make some guesses about the narrator. I hope this is all somewhat clear. So moving on to different kinds of narration. This is usually divided into three different groups. So there are omniscient narrators, so narrators who know absolutely everything. There are limited narrators who know a lot, so more than the characters do, but not absolutely everything. Often the limited narrator knows everything about one character, but not very much about others. So for example, the narrator of Cat Person is most likely a limited narrator. So we get intimate details about Margot. We learn everything about her, really, but we don't know very much about Robert except through his interactions with her. So that's a limited narrator. Omniscient, let me think about where we've seen omniscient narrators before. Actually, nothing's coming. Well, I guess the author, well, we'll talk about this in a bit. I mean, the author of Rue is a first-person narrator, so it's limited kind of necessarily, but also kind of omniscient in a way. We learn things that the character as herself should never know. Maybe the author of The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas might be omniscient too, although arguably also limited because there are things that the narrator says they don't know. Anyway, we could discuss where we see omniscient narrators. And then objective narrators are those who don't know much more than the characters do. Often first-person narrators are going to be objective because they only know as much as that character does. But also you can have third-person narrators who don't have any special knowledge about the scene. They just kind of present things in this objective way. They just tell us what we would see if we were there. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about this concept. So that brings me to Rue. So I think it's worth talking about what makes Rue so interesting, especially in terms of its narration. So let's see. I'll say a little bit about Rue before talking about narration in Rue. I think Rue might be my favorite novel in this class. I love this novel, and I love it more, I think, every time I read it. And what I like about it is just, what I like about it really is its tone. And we talked about the difference between mood and tone, where mood is, the way the characters feel, and whereas it's diegetic, whereas tone is non-diegetic. It's the way that the author wants us to feel about the novel. Excuse me. So it's the tone that I think is so fascinating here, because of course, what's described in the novel is often very tragic. It's often very dramatic, but the way it's written, I find very beautiful and delicate and strange and loving, often graceful, I think is a word I might use, both in the sense of kind of elegant and smooth, but also in the sense of kind of bringing grace, having an attitude of grace, almost in like the Christian sense, right? Where it's approaching something that should be condemned with an element of forgiveness and understanding. So it's fascinating in that way. I feel like if I were writing a story, if had been a refugee, which is something that is way beyond my area of expertise and experience, I would probably write a very different text. I would probably write one that was a lot more full of anger and pain. But the tone here I think is very unusual, and so it's worth asking why that is, and how Kim Twee gets that across. So I think narration is actually one way that Kim Twee pulls off this strangeness. And by the way, it would help, I think, if you're watching this video and you're listening for ideas about the text, it would help to get out the novel at this point, and also maybe open up Brian Bethune's article, because I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So I think one of the things that's so odd about this novel is its narration. So on a surface level, it's a first-person narrator, very simple kind of first-person narrator. But it's not that simple, really, because the first-person narrator, as I mentioned before, is almost omniscient. It's a first-person narrator who knows things that a first-person narrator shouldn't know. So, for example, we see this right at the beginning on page 1, where she talks about her own birth. She says, "I came into the world during the Tet Offensive in the early days of the Year of the Monkey, when the long chains of firecrackers draped in front of houses exploded polyphonically along with the sound of machine guns." So she's describing when she was born, 1968, which is actually when Kim Twee was born, and also when the Tet Offensive was. She couldn't possibly remember this, and yet she tells it in an extreme amount of detail. It might help too to explain a little bit about the Tet Offensive if you're not familiar with it. So this was a turning point in the Vietnam War, 1968. So in the Vietnam War, you have North Vietnam, which was communist, and South Vietnam, which was capitalist and supported by the US. So the Tet Offensive in 1968 was a surprise attack from the north into the south, especially in Saigon, which is where the narrator's family lives, and also where Twee lived. Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. It's a holiday. So when she talks about fireworks going off with the sound of machine guns, this is literal, right? This was a New Year's celebration which was interrupted by an attack. So we have this weird combination of emotions and events, both celebration and tragedy at the exact same time, and which sound almost identical to each other. But at any rate, this is, we have a narrator here who's telling us something the narrator couldn't possibly know. I think we see another example of this on page 29, when the narrator talks about the soldiers who occupied her home. This is something that Zach actually wrote about in his Canvas post. So thank you, Zach. I think this is a great observation, that there are things that the narrator seems to know that are odd. There are things the narrator knows that the soldier doesn't know, which I think is what Zach pointed out, and also things that the narrator shouldn't know about the soldier. So for example, after talking about how the soldier doesn't know what bras are, she says, let's see, this is the paragraph break on page 29 in my edition. And if you don't have the same edition, it's the section that begins, "When the communists entered Saigon, my family handed over half our property because we'd become vulnerable." That's how the section starts, and then this is on the next page. She says, "At the foot of the Long Bien Bridge that crosses the Red River in Hanoi, every night his mother, the soldier's mother, would fill her coffee filter, then dip it into her aluminum coffee pot to make a few cups that she'd sell to passerby. In the winter, she placed glasses containing barely 3 sips into a bowl filled with hot water to keep them warm during conversations between men sitting on benches raised just a bit above the ground." And then she goes on and on. But the detail here is incredible, and there's no way the narrator could possibly know this. Not only, I mean, she wasn't there. She wasn't born at the time that this was happening, assuming the soldier's older than she is. So there's something very strange there too. And then the last example I wanted to show, which isn't the last example in the novel by any means, is on page 61 in my edition. It's the section that starts with "My mother envied my uncle's irresponsibility, or rather his capacity for it." And then in the second paragraph at the bottom of this page, she says that she describes her mother's relationship with her siblings. And she says, and so she, her mother, became established as manager of the supreme authority. I remember one day when my grandmother didn't even dare ask her to unlock the bathroom door and release her little brother and sisters who were being punished for going out with Uncle Two without my mother's permission. As she was only a young girl, she administered her authority naively with an iron hand. So again, we have something the narrator couldn't possibly have seen, but she says she remembers it. She says, "I remember one day." But what she's remembering is something that happened when her own mother was a child. So she couldn't possibly actually remember it, and yet she says she does. So again, we have this weird conflict between the first-person narrator and the omniscient narrator. And I think that's part of what gives this book its weird tone. So all of this is odd, and it might make us ask, why is it written this way? What is this? What can we make of all of this? And to try to answer that question, I think it might help to turn to our critical reading for today, which is Brian Bethune's article, which is based on an interview with Kim Twee. So Brian Bethune says a couple of really fascinating things. I think one of the passages that I think really sheds some light on this conversation is in paragraph 3, which is mostly based on direct quotes from Kim Twee, but they're quotes that Brian Bethune has pulled out, so we still have to give credit to him. And he quotes Kim Twee as saying that being a refugee, especially as opposed to being an immigrant, means being outside of time and outside of space, in something of a no man's land. And she also says, and I quote, to be a human being, you have to be part of something. But when you're a refugee, you're stateless and part of nothing. So we have, she describes a person who is outside of time, outside of space, and as such is almost kind of removed from this human family, which sounds kind of awful. But at the same time, I think we can take that observation and apply it to Rue and see in the things that we've said that almost gives her a kind of freedom and a different kind of perspective. one of the reasons maybe that she can kind of step outside of her own perspective and outside of her own time period and claim to remember things that she didn't actually see is that, she is kind of removed from her time and her space. This might also relate to what she says on page 2 of the novel, which we might see as a kind of, because it's so early, we might see it as something that structures much of the rest of the novel. And we'll talk about this on Thursday too, or I'll talk about this on Thursday, where she says on page 2, she talks about her relationship to her mother. She says, with these almost interchangeable names, my mother confirmed that I was the sequel to her, that I would continue her story. And then says that the history of Vietnam, written with the capital H, thwarted my mother's plans. History flung the accents on our names into the water. In particular, when I was 10 years old, it ended, and this is later in the paragraph, when I was 10 years old, it ended my role as an extension of my mother. So we have her kind of stepping outside of herself in the way that Brian Bethune describes. The cat's coming back, hold on. No. Stay up. It's Hachie again. We have her kind of outside of space, outside of time, outside of her own perspective, but not aimless, not lost and hopeless, but kind of united or trying to unite with people in her absence, in her statelessness, which I think is kind of interesting. This also relates in a way to things that Toni Morrison has talked about, not so much in Recitatif, but in Morrison's most famous novel, which is called Beloved, she writes about something called rememory. Stop it. I don't know if you can hear that. Cat's trying to get attention. Yeah, Morrison writes about something called a rememory, especially in relation to slavery in the minds of the descendants of slaves today. And the idea is that even though descendants of slaves can't literally remember slavery because they weren't there, there's a kind of cultural memory that feels like memory, that has an effect of memory. And I think we may see something like that in this refugee perspective that Kim Twee talks about, in the way that that being outside of time and outside of space gives you a kind of memory that couldn't ever really be memory. So I've already talked about how this might be related to Morrison, even though it's not something she mentions in Recitatif. We might also ask how to apply and adapt Brian Bethune's ideas to other readings in this class, which is something similar to what you'll be doing in Essay 2. So we have this idea that refugee literature is an attempt to capture this perspective of being outside of time and outside of space. So what can we do with these ideas? And notice we don't necessarily have to only apply these ideas to other kinds of refugee literature. Yes, that's what he and Twee are talking about, but it's there are more fundamental ideas here, right? Including just the very idea that you can potentially be outside of time and outside of space. So one place we might want to look is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's work, which is because Adichie herself is an immigrant. Or at least something like an immigrant. She splits her time between Nigeria and the United States, and her story, which we read, Tomorrow is Too Far, follows somebody who splits their time between Nigeria and the United States, whose parents also are immigrants. And so we might ask, well, can these ideas about immigrant and refugee literature be used to shed new light on Adichie's work? Or in other words, can we look at Tomorrow is Too Far and make any comments about how the characters are either outside of time or how they avoid being outside of time? And actually, I think this applies to some of the Canvas posts from that story, Canvas post 15. So for example, there's a kind of tension between the posts by Frank and Tom. So Frank, they both wrote about, both of you wrote about how the word summer repeats frequently at the beginning in the first couple of paragraphs of the story before suddenly it says that it was the summer that Nonso died, and then suddenly it doesn't mention summer again. And Frank and Tom interpreted this in two different ways. Frank said that what we see there is that summer halts. That was the word he used, as kind of implying that we have a kind of end of time, that this moment takes the narrator out of time, almost in the way that Twee is taken out of time, giving her a different perspective. So we can maybe apply some of Bethune's ideas to the story in that way. But Tom had a different perspective, and Tom said, instead of just kind of ending summer and taking her out of time, the fact that she stopped talking about summer, quote, means that she was, quote, thrust into a permanent winter. So it's not so much that she's taken out of time as that she's given kind of a different sense of time. And that might help to mark a distinction too between the refugee literature of Rue, where the narrator is thrown back and forth to different time periods and different perspectives, to something like Tomorrow is Too Far, which is maybe a little bit more controlled, where time is shifted but not necessarily terminated. I think we can also look at Frankenstein, especially if we want to look at writing which is outside of space. Because we talked about loneliness a lot in Frankenstein and how Frankenstein has no home. So I think Caroline T's Canvas post on Frankenstein in Canvas post number 5 is pretty interesting in this regard. So Caroline wrote that we have basic human desires to have home and companionship, and that the lack of these things, the lack of a home and the lack of companions can drive a person insane. And there, I think we have a similar kind of observation about what can happen if you are taken in a way outside of space, but also kind of adds a different layer, because we can see how Frankenstein or the creature is taken out of space, but what really affects him is his solitude. It's solitude, Caroline says, that drives him crazy. Whereas in Rue, she has her mother as a model, even though she can't be an extension of her mother in the same way. She has her. She has these companions which allow her this gracefulness that the creature doesn't have. And then the final connection that I thought of making is to The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, where we have, again, a kind of, Omelas itself is kind of outside of time and outside of space because it's a fictional allegorical place, but also we have the people who walk away who are going into a place that may not exist, who are refugees in a way, even though we don't follow them as much. And I'm also thinking about Lexi's thesis in Essay 1. Oh, here comes the cat again. Where Lexi wrote that the people in Omelas are able to excuse themselves for treating this child so terribly because they first dehumanize him. And Brian Bethune has a kind of argument about what we mean by human, right? Quote, to be human, you have to be part of something. And maybe Bethune could give us, make more sense of, or give us an argument about that definition of humanity, to affirm and give detail to the argument that Lexi is making. So to kind of walk through what I just did here, to give you a sense of how you can replicate it in your own writing, I tried to explain what Brian Bethune was saying, through direct, in many cases through direct quotes from Kim Twee. I tried to explain what he was saying and summarize it, and take out the major concepts from that. And the concepts being that it's possible for a person to be outside of time and outside of space, that being outside of time and space gives you a different perspective, that being outside of time and outside of space somehow, I guess, affect your humanity or undermine your humanity. I took these ideas and tried to make sense of them in different contexts. So it's not just that I made a comparison between Brian Bethune's article and Tomorrow is Too Far, or between Rue and Tomorrow is Too Far, but I tried to take these ideas about humanity or about time and space and figure out what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie or Mary Shelley might have said about these ideas, or might be saying about these ideas, so that I can make a claim about these texts that I couldn't really have made without the intervention of Brian Bethune. So that was my attempt. And it's a pretty rough attempt. Again, I'm nervous talking to myself in this way, and hopefully, and may not have made all that much sense, but hopefully that'll give you a sense at least of what kind of thing I'm asking you to do in Essay 2. Anyway, that is all I have today. I expect these lectures won't always be this long, especially because I opened with these syllabus changes, which I won't do every time. Yeah, let me know if you thought that was helpful. Thank you.